So, 10 to 20. Already halfway through this thing. Up to 20. 45, 10 to 20. You shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, and you and your children, and your children's children, and your flocks, and your herds, and all that you have. This is a promise that Joseph gave Jacob and his family, of which he was part. But now he's number two, actually, behind Pharaoh in Egypt, in charge of everything. There I will provide for you, for there are still 5 years of famine to come. He knew this, I guess, from God. And you and your household and all that you have would have been impoverished. Behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see. That is my mouth which is speaking to you. Now you must tell my father of all my splendor in Egypt, and all that you have seen, and you must hurry and bring my father down here. Then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. He kissed all his brothers, all of them, and wept on them, and afterward his brothers talked with him. Now they're reconciled. Now when the news was heard in Pharaoh's house that Joseph's brothers had come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, say to your brothers, do this, load your beasts up and go to the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat of the land. Now you are ordered, do this, take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. What a welcome. Do not concern yourselves with your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. So they came to Egypt on good blessings and prosperity. We will find out later why they were so enslaved, but that's another story. That's another story, the sovereignty of God and the will of man. In this case, the will of Pharaoh. Expositors, where they could continue to raise their families and livestock during the 5 remaining years of famine. In the midst of the famine, the sons of Israel were to be well provided for in Goshen. It can hardly be without purpose that this picture of God's chosen people dwelling safely and prosperously in the land that Joseph provided for them comes at the close of the book of Genesis, and that it is a near replica of the way things were in the beginning. The writer appears intentionally to draw our attention to the connection between the end of the book and the beginning. Thus, when the Pharaoh restated Joseph's offer and twice gave the brothers the good, best of the land of Egypt, it is hard not to see in the purpose of this narrative a conscious allusion to the good land given to Adam in the first chapter of the book. The picture of Joseph is a picture of restoration, not just the restoration of the good fortune of Jacob, but as a picture of the restoration of the blessing that was promised through the offspring of Jacob. Interesting. God's sovereignty, how many works through circumstance and the will of man, and his decrees and sovereignty, his foreordination, will work precisely as he established it and decreed it. Bible Knowledge Commentary says, the whole family must move to Egypt and live in the region of Goshen, a fertile area in the Nile Delta, to dwell under Joseph's rule, because God had prepared the way through all the circumstances. Finally, the brothers were reunited, first Benjamin and Joseph and Benjamin, then all of them. Those were emotion-filled moments, filled with weeping and then conversation. Their previous hatred and jealousy of Joseph was now gone. And Joseph didn't want any vengeance. Instructions were given to the brothers to bring Jacob's entire family to Egypt. Pharaoh himself instructed them to return, offering them the best of the land of Egypt, providing carts for transporting the family members back, and promising them the best of all Egypt. Finishing off, what a marvelous chapter. Make sure you read the chapters 42, 43, 44 before you get to 45. And it builds and builds the sovereignty of God. And then this is a wonderful allusion back to the Garden of Eden. Genesis 45, 21 to 28. Then the sons of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them wagons. Remember, the sons of Israel, only a number of them, 70 some odd. And Joseph gave them wagons according to the command of Pharaoh, and gave them provisions for the journey. To each of them he gave changes of garments, but to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of garments. To his father he sent as follows: 10 donkeys loaded with the best things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread and sustenance for his father on the journey. Thought of all the details. Pharaoh. So he sent his brothers away, and as they departed, he said to them, "Do not quarrel on the journey." Then they went up from Egypt and came to the land of Canaan to their father Joseph. They told him, saying, "Joseph is still alive, and indeed he is ruler over all the land of Egypt." But he was stunned, for he did not believe them. What a fantasy story! When they told him all the words of Joseph that he had spoken to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. Then Israel said, "It is enough, my son. Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Lost sight of the Abrahamic covenant. Now we've got it reinstituted in their revived mentor, Jacob. Jacob's response to the news of Joseph's plays a key role in connecting these narratives to the message of the Pentateuch as a whole. Throughout the Pentateuch, there is a focus on the response of God's people to the work of God. At important moments in the narrative, this response is interpreted as either one of faith or no faith. Depends upon the passage and the circumstance. Jacob's response falls in with these other examples. Here, however, the writer gives a deeper insight into the nature of his faith. At first, when Jacob heard the news that Joseph was alive, his heart grew numb. Jacob was stunned, and he did not believe. But when he heard the words of Joseph and saw all that he had sent to take him back to Egypt, the spirit of Jacob revived, and he set out to go to him. The faith of Abraham bore the same marks as that of the other occurrences of faith throughout the Pentateuch. But in this text alone, a different dimension is stressed. That new dimension in Jacob's faith is the contrast between his numbed heart and his revived spirit. Jacob's lack of faith is identified with his numbed heart. When his spirit was renewed, however, he believed. This viewpoint expressed here is very similar to that of the later prophetic literature, where faith and the new heart are synonymous, and where lack of faith is synonymous with numbness. All these texts seem to be summed up in the words of David in Psalm 51, "Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." Bible Knowledge Commentary. Joseph gave his brothers elaborate provisions for their journey, including clothing, food, and for Jacob, the best things of Egypt. As they left, Joseph told his brothers not to quarrel on the way. This was not a time for accusations and recriminations. It was a time for joyful reunion. Yet he knew that they could fall out on the way home. At first, Jacob was stunned with unbelief at his son's report that Joseph was alive, but then, hearing their story and seeing what all Joseph had sent him, Jacob was convinced and immediately decided to make the move and see his son. The royal invitation to Jacob, the old patriarch, near the end of hope. Where is the Abrahamic covenant? The end of hope. And to the 10 brothers burdened with guilt was a turning point in their lives and a fulfillment of God's prediction, and that they would go into isolation in a foreign country and multiply without losing their identity. Genesis 15:13-16. Let me take a look at that. Genesis 15:13-16. God said to Abram, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. Actually, if you look at that carefully, Galatians 3:17 says 430 years. But that less the time spent in the land of Canaan, the promised land, is 215, so it leaves 215 years. And we have a study on that, and you can see there was a mistranslation there by the words in the Hebrew. And the Septuagint clears that up, plus Paul clears it up. You can take a look at that. If we looked at Exodus 12:40-41, translated from the Septuagint Greek and the Samaritan Pentateuch, Exodus 12:40 translated, "And the sojourning of the children of Israel while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan was 430 years. That way it adds up, because both together add up to 430. 215 in the land of Canaan, 2:15 in the land of Egypt. And that way, there is no contradiction later on when you try to match up the historical and years events. So the key difference between the Masoretic Hebrew text completed in the 4th century A.D. and the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, completed centuries earlier during the reign of King Ptolemy Philadelphia of Egypt, and the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is also considerably more ancient and allowed by many scholars to be the most correct copy of the 5 books of Moses, is the phrase, "and the land of Canaan, the promised land." This phrase is omitted in the Masoretic text, evidently due to a scribal error or deliberate omission, but it is included in the other, much earlier versions. The period of 430 years for the entire time from the Lord's promise to Abraham to the Exodus is corroborated by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. So he had access. And where it says, "Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made," he does not say into seeds as many, but as one, and your seed is Christ. "And this I say, that the law, which was 430 years later, cannot annul the covenant that was confirmed before by God in Christ, that it should make the promise of no effect." So according to the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Apostle Paul, the period of 430 years commenced at the time when the Lord first said to Abram, "Get out of the country and go to a land he will show them," whereupon the Lord then made his promise of his covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12. So you can look at that, and there's some more proof of that, but that's minor. It's interesting that do a little homework here, and you find this amount of time in Egypt is more feasible than 430 years, only 2:15, and a careful examination of scriptures indicate that the period of 400 years to which Genesis 15:13 and Acts 7:6 refer overlaps the 430 year, beginning the 30th year of the latter period. So, we've done a little research, and that's it. So isn't that a marvelous thing? Ponder the sovereignty of God, the foreordination of God in all things, yet up to the will of man and historical circumstances that man brings upon himself, not the least of which, though we see, look at the famine in the land. What was causal of that? All things are decreed by God, but he allows the conditions of the earth to prevail without superintending and manipulating everything. Yet his decrees are so sovereign, foreordination in every little detail, that these things come to pass naturally as he created them. So little superintending is needed throughout the universe because God has already foreordained it to go the way it's going.